Bienvenue à nouveau dans l'Auditorium pour notre après-midi consacré cette fois-ci à la sculpture monumentale, cette fois-ci néo-hittite et araméenne. Nous franchissons le passage douloureux entre l'âge du bronze et l'âge du fer, passage que nous avions déjà amorcé avec Kay Kohlmeyer à la fin de la matinée. Et nous allons donc commencer notre après-midi avec Sanna Aro. Sanna Aro qui est professeure donc à l'université d'Helsinki, au département des cultures du monde. Alors, Sanna Aro, elle s'est intéressée dans sa thèse à un des royaumes néo-hittites les plus, je dirais, les plus méconnus. Déjà que les royaumes néo-hittites en général ne sont pas très connus. Alors imaginez donc cette région qu'on appelle le Tabal, c'est ainsi que les sources assyriennes le mentionnent, mais qui est vraisemblablement plutôt une mosaïque de petits royaumes. Et je vous invite à lire l'article qu'elle a écrit pour le catalogue de l'exposition, qui est très très éclairant sur la question. Elle a donc publié sa thèse dans la foulée et parmi les nombreux articles que Sanna a écrits depuis maintenant quelques années, eh bien, il y a eu dans la grande synthèse de Melkert, de Luvians, en 2003, eh bien, elle a rédigé un assez complet article qui s'intitulait « Art and Architecture », justement sur la question de l'art néo-hittite en général. Et en ce moment, d'après ce que l'on peut lire d'elle, elle s'intéresse aussi beaucoup aux relations entre l'art néo-hittite et l'art néo-assyrien. Mais aujourd'hui, elle va nous parler d'une recherche qu'elle mène et qui est effectivement extrêmement intéressante sur la statuaire dans les états néo-hittites et araméens. Vous savez que pour l'art néo-hittite araméen, on pense souvent aux reliefs, aux orthostates, ces dalles de pierre qu'on trouve à la base des murs, mais Sanna s'intéresse beaucoup à la statuaire, à la ronde-bosse, et je lui laisse maintenant la parole. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Vincent. Merci pour l'invitation. Mon français est très mauvais. C'est parce que je parle anglais. So let's start. We had some technical problems and I fell down from the stairs, so excuse me if I'm a bit confused. Yes, I will begin with a quote from a letter of T. Lawrence, and we only need the chest and beard to complete a colossal statue of a standing god in the round about 7 feet high. We have also the pedestal of this god, 2 large lions, and the problem before us is how to set him up. With these words by T. Lawrence, also known as the Arabian Lawrence, describing his diligent work with sculpture pieces in Karkemish just before the beginning of the World War I start my talk about a particular group of stone sculpture, namely the néo-hittite 3-dimensional and freestanding statues. This statue was, as far as we can judge from the remaining parts of it, one of the most impressive and outstanding representatives of its group, and it echoes others that stood for centuries on equally focal spots in the monumental centers of the néo-hittite city-states. But its current desolate state of preservation also epitomizes the difficulties we have when try to understand and make sense of fragmented and scattered piece of evidence. When I prepared this talk, I had some difficulties on which level to pitch the topic. Since many years, I have collected material for a monograph about néo-hittite anthropomorphic stone images in the round, and I could give whole lecture series about them. I finally choose to focus in this one piece, namely the Karkemish B53 plus B54, and take it as a spokesperson for these groups of statues when outlining the most important features of the statue phenomenon. 30 minutes is too short to recapitulate or even mention all the aspects of the néo-hittite statue habits, but here you will get at least some highlights. This Karkemish statue belongs to a group of three-dimensional freestanding stone statues, both seated and standing. They're often set up on fancy pedestals that were either inscribed stone blocks or sculpted with double lions, as our Karkemish piece, or double bulls. And in two cases, we have also the image set up on a base in form of a chariot drawn by bulls. Additionally, Chinchirli and Somali features with one pedestal with double horses and two separate horse heads that probably not belonged to the same statue. As a stone material, dark basalt and light limestone are the most common medium. This Karkemish statue is sculpted of grey basalt that is available in the region of Karkemish. The exact source of the stone is not known. Some of the statues or fragments or the pedestals of them bear inscriptions. And either in hieroglyphic Luwian, Aramaic, Phoenician, or bilingual Phoenician hieroglyphic Luwian. The standing caryatids from Tel Halaf, like the one currently exhibited here in this show, are provided with captions in Akkadian language using cuneiform. These inscriptions are not a random feature of these statues, but vital to our understanding how this néo-Hittite statue habit functioned. I personally perceive néo-Hittite practice of making monuments as a special communication system in which images, especially the freestanding statues, have an intrinsic link with texts, regardless in which language and or script the inscriptions were written. In this communication system, inscriptions, their carriers and artwork form one monument. And that is why they should be studied together. I will later describe the connection between the statues and the text more in detail, but let us first proceed with some technical data. The height of these statues, as far as one can estimate the size from the preserved fragments, varies roughly between 1.5 and 4 meters, depending a bit if a seated or a standing figure is depicted. The vast majority of the examples are thus life-size or over-life size. Because of the over-life size of some of these monuments, they have been described as colossal. This label can of course be used, but we have to bear in mind that the dimensions of this group do not by any means reach those of true colossi, very popular, for example, in Egypt or during the Hellenistic and again in the Roman period. Like, for example, the statue of the Constantine the Great in the courtyard of the Palazzo dei Conservatori in Rome. Our Karkemish piece was one of the major pieces of the néo-Hittite freestanding statues. According to the preserved pedestal and the head compared with the measures of the better preserved example from Chinchirli, its total height should be over 4 meters. It is of course nothing compared to the gigantic statues being erected in India and China today, but for ancient Near Eastern standards, this is true monumentality. This statue from Karkemish is important, but why do we actually know so very little about it? Generally, this is a sculpture category that has so far been almost totally neglected by the scholarship. Yes, there exist some monographs and lavishly illustrated books about the art of the Hittites and the néo-Hittites that include a photo or two of freestanding statues in order to show that this class of objects existed as well. But they don't go into the detail, and these photographs mostly give the front view, sometimes the side view, but almost never the back view. These three-dimensional statues are thus reduced into a forced two-dimensionality, and as you can see from the pictures, also the necks can be interesting. This is a group of monuments that have been abandoned and gone unnoticed. There are mainly two reasons for our disinterest and ignorance. First of all, due to the past and present iconoclastic and other destructive activities, only few representatives of the néo-hittite freestanding statues have survived until today, either intact or nearly intact. And because they scant aesthetic merits and the damaged condition, the freestanding statues have been so far neglected in the scholarly literature. Fragments of sculpture generally attract very little attention. Ugly statues seem still to be 250 years after Joachim Winckelmann uninteresting, thus not worthy of a study. Here we are in the heart of the Louvre, surrounded by a dazzling amount of truly beautiful art, and now this very nice, intriguing exhibition. These statues are not sculpted in translucent marble, but they have other qualities, and they tell other stories. My personal travelogue and obsession with these statues started in Adana Archaeological Museum when I had my first encounter with a statue found accidentally in Cineke, a little village close to Adana in Silesia, present-day Turkey. I had seen the first photos of this intriguing piece already 10 years earlier in London while helping David Hawkins to get his corpus of the hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions ready, and I knew the publication of its bilingual Phoenician Luwian inscription by André Lemaire and Recai Tekolu very well. But there in Adana, that day, going around the statue dozens of times, photographing all the details not discernible in the published photos, it was such a tremendous experience for me, so many things spinning in my head of iconographical details, but also questions popping up. One of the most pressing questions was, if this figure standing on the bull-drawn chariot is the Luwian storm god Tarhunza, why is it dressed in a profane gown entirely in concert of the contemporary Neo-Assyrian high officials? So, ever since my encounter with the Cineke statue in Adana, I have wished to promote and rehabilitate this group of sculpture. I am convinced that an old-fashioned corpus of all known pieces would greatly enlighten us about the size and statue practice in the Near-Hittite world. I wanted to give these statues a chance, make some sense out of them, and very soon my studies led me very deep into the nature and purpose of this group of sculpture. I have given efforts to see and study as many of the pieces myself as possible. As I already claimed, most of the published photographs do not show details that often are crucial in dating and interpretation. Additionally, as Irene Winter has aptly argued, photographed works lose their scale even when published with an accompanying caption giving measurements, and thus only an autopsy of the material can give one the feeling of the real size of the pieces. However, freestanding statues of storm gods and rulers were an extensive phenomenon in the Near-Hittite material culture, much more extensive than I had thought myself when I started cataloguing them. Today, I have over 70 pieces in my catalogue and hope still to get a few items to it. Tim Harrison just told me from the new findings in Tel Tainet last evening. This is a relative large number if compared with other periods and regions in the ancient Near East. This catalogue of mine comprises not only pieces of statue bodies or head or other body parts, but I have naturally also compiled the statue pedestals, also the textual attestations of statues. So I have the statues themselves, or then only heads that are preserved. Then I have pedestals, like this Hadatu one, only the pedestal survives. I have inscribed stone blocks which served as pedestals. And then I have only inscriptions that refer to a statue. So let's now have a very quick look to the spatial distribution. Most of the findings come from the northern Syrian area around Karkemish, Chinchurli and Tel Tainat, as well as from Marash, and generally we can also see that most of the freestanding statues have been found in areas which were under the political control of the Bronze Age Hittite Empire. An interesting exception is, however, the surroundings of the modern city of Şanlıurfa, that has many recent statue findings, but curiously enough, only of double bull pedestals. Two of these double bull pedestals also bear hieroglyphic inscriptions. Tel Halaf, with the seated funerary statues, as well as the so-called caryatids, form a special case. So we have over 70 pieces of freestanding statues. What is going on here? Fundamental to our understanding of this statue phenomenon, as already touched in case of the Neo-Assyrian official standing on a bull chariot of the storm guard from Chinegay, is the basic identification of the statues. Which one represent the storm guard and which one rulers? Earlier, many scholars regarded pretty much all these statues to represent gods, like T. Lawrence in his letter home mentioning this standing guard. This trend lasted quite long, and it was not before 1954 when Henry Frankfurt started making suggestions that, for example, the statue of Chinchurli that, quote, the absence of all divine attributes makes it probable that the statue found in Chinchurli represents a king, perhaps Kilamuva, and not a god, as is sometimes attested, quote, ended. Still, the division between the storm guards and the rulers is not that clear-cut, and we have now a quick look into one of such cases. It is another example of Karkemish statues which the British Museum excavation team found smashed in over 60 fragments. It was thought to be a god because its name was provided with the divine determinative here. But this deity was not attested elsewhere. Herzfeld called it Moloch. It was David Hawkins who gently analyzed the name Atri-Suha as Atri plus Suha, soul of Suhi, and suggested it to represent Suhi the first, the deified ancestor of the line of country lords of Karkemish. Our statue from Karkemish, which one is it? My working hypothesis is that we can make rough iconographical division between the storm guards and ruler statues with the help of the pedestals. The symbol of the Anatolian and Syrian storm guard is the bull, and one should think that double bull pedestals should be reserved for the storm guard only. Those statues that we know to have been set up on double lion pedestals, that is the one from Chinchurli, and then our examples from Karkemish, seem all to be rulers. As far as the horned cap is concerned, the identification is much more difficult. Storm guard is wearing a horned cap, but it can also be worn by deceased and deified rulers, as in case of Atri-Suha. And these are two examples of head fragments, one from Karatepe and one from Marash, which bear caps, but in these cases the identification is not quite clear. I have used the premise as a working hypothesis that for a viewer, theoretically, a statue should be instantly recognizable. There had to be a system to facilitate the identification, and this system used both iconographical attributes as well as inscribed names. The Karkemish statue, with its imposing double lion pedestal, obviously represented a Karkemish ruler. But which one? Certainly it did matter. Now, in this exhibition, I went there yesterday for a very quick look, and there you have identified it as a Katuva. We don't know for sure if it's Katuva or another Karkemishian ruler. While tackling with the problem of the identification of the statues, I also started looking into the inscriptions. Many of these statues and their pedestals bear inscriptions, but not all of them. What is the relationship between the image and the text? Can they help us further? Observation. Our Karkemishian example belongs to a subgroup of ruler statues that look more or less the same. Can we explain this coiffure canon of big curls, enlarged eyes, and big ears and the tight mouth? I think they are all parts of the manifestation of the ideal rulership, the néo-hittite version of the able and righteous ruler. This phenomenon can be compared with the study that Irene Winter has made with the Gudea statues, namely suggesting that these formal properties were actually highly coded signifiers of meaning. Because all the ruler statues look the same and don't seem to bear any individual features, they had to be identified somehow. It is an inscription that makes the statue a real individual. That is why all the statue inscriptions, as far as preserved, very many are not, start with the Anatolian hieroglyphic sign 1, which will be transcribed as ego, and 2, ego 2, meaning I am. Semantically, this ego sign, by pointing with the bent arm and hand toward a human face in profile, identifies the image as being a representation of the inscription's composer. The purpose of this practice must originally lie in a need to give viewers information about the identity of an anthropomorphic image. In cases where a statue itself or its pedestal bears the inscription, the image is literally made to speak in the first person. This statue's indexical nature is also reinforced by the personal name attached to the ego sign. Apparently, these images were perceived as a substitute for the person they represented, and we know it from the Mesopotamian tradition. Text beginning with this introductory formula did not necessarily have to be inscribed on the statue itself or its pedestal. For our Karkemishian piece, it is uncertain if its body was inscribed or not. We will see at the end of this talk that we have no information for its chest and upper back that might have served as text carriers. There exist furthermore statues with Aramaic or Phoenician inscriptions that also begin with the first person singular, but do not represent the ruler but the storm god. And there I have to work my working hypothesis further. And some of these statues like the one from Chinchilli, do not bear an inscription, but because the name is needed, it would obviously be an unimage without it. To explain why there is ruler statues without an inscription, I have suggested that sometimes the text was brought on a stone block, that stood in a close physical relationship to an uninscribed statue and connected with the statue by referring to it in the text. Thus, for the inscription Karkemish A1A on the so-called Long Wall of Karkemish by a ruler called Suhi, in which he reports paragraph 28, and for myself, my statue I set up. We must imagine that this image was set up in the vicinity of the wall, but unfortunately no identifiable remains of these particular statues were found by the excavators. In some cases, the connection of the text and the statues mentioned in the text is reinforced with the demonstrative pronoun za, this. This kind of continuous connections between a statue and an inscription is nicely exemplified in the case of the statue of Atrisuha mentioned already above. The inscription slab Karkemish A11A was found in situ on the so-called King's Gate. Here is the inscription. In Karkemish stating that paragraph 20, this god, Atrisuha, I seated at these gates with goodness. Due to the lack of information, this Karkemishian statue has been thought to represent different rulers and the so-called Suhikatuva dynasty of the city, as I already pointed out. But what is the truly important ramification of our Karkemishian statue belonging to a ruler of the Suhikatuva dynasty? In an article published in 2013, I believe to have demonstrated that behind this statue phenomenon lie an ideological concept that was materialized by mixing Empire Hittite iconographical elements with the local Syrian tradition discernible in the Middle Bronze Age, such as Ebla and Katna. The original function of the hieroglyphic sign ego, introducing very many of the hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions, was to serve as semantic linkage to the freestanding statues, and this practice can be traced back at least to Talia IV and his son Suppiluliuma II, thus to the final phase of the Hittite Empire. There is no time here to go into details. If you are interested in my line of argumentation, you can download the article in my profile in academia.edu. Therefore, our Karkemishian statue is one link in a chain that connects the Hittites with their Near-Hittite successors. But it also belongs to a longer chain of ancient Near Eastern monuments with text beginning with the first-person singular pronoun. Chronologically, the first seems to be Idrimi of Alalach, and the last one Ashurbanipal of Nineveh, applying it in his relief images. I proceed now to show what we know about the purpose of these statues and what message did they deliver. Here available inscriptions, archaeological context and details of the monuments themselves give us information. As already pointed out, the texts that stand in connection to freestanding statues all begin with the sign ego, identifying the person the statue represents, giving us the name, titles, and sometimes genealogical data. The texts that follow are of a particular commemorative type. They contain standardized formulations and topics always in more or less same order. The details and number of the topics may vary, but the structure remains the same. So there was a different messages in this text, but they also report about the building activities and other stuff. But the crucial thing is also the act itself, setting up the image, because it becomes an object of veneration. These statues are focal points of ancestry cult, and they receive offerings. Some texts report of yearly offerings, both for the divine statues as well as for the rulers. Concerning offerings, Davis Ussishkin published a seminal paper in 1975 in which he pointed out that many of the statue pedestals had obvious offering cups, like this from Chinchirli has 3 cups on each of the heads where the offering was poured. And because both the divine as well as the ruler statues were not just images, but divinity of or the ruler itself, it was vital for the to protect the monuments with a curse formula against those who violate the monument. The offerings bring us to the actions and where the statues received these offerings. The pedestal of our Karkemish statue was found in situ, and so were some other pedestals in Karkemish. These contexts let us assume that these statues were erected on public spaces and also in close proximity to wall lines, often on or in gatehouses. This seems to be a different practice from Mesopotamia, where divine statues, but also ruler statues, as far as we are informed, are mostly housed in temples. It seems that we have to imagine these open squares and gate entrances created social spaces where large public performances and civic spectacles took place. The statues had a central role in these cultic activities, especially as receivers of offerings, but probably also as monuments that kept up collective memory of the city. We also must imagine an interaction with the spectators, with the people who brought offerings to the statue. What kind of effect did they have to the viewers? Were the people even fleetingly experiencing an aesthetic wonder? Did they ever thought that these images were beautiful? But what happened to our Karkemish statue? Why is it that only a few of these monuments have come down to us in intact or nearly intact condition? Originally, once installed, the statues were meant to stand eternally on their spaces. But exactly because they not only represented either storm god or a ruler, but they were embodiments of the deity or the rulership of the city, once an enemy army managed to conquer and intrude into the very heart of the city, the statues were obvious targets for iconoclastic and other actions. As far as I can see, storm guards were deported by the army of the enemy. This was a widely common practice of so-called guard napping in the ancient Near East, attested in multiple text sources, and I think it is also corroborated in the archaeological finding situations. For example, for Karkemish and also for Aslantash Hadatu, the excavators only discovered double bull pedestals, but no fragments of the statue itself, indicating that the image of the storm gods had been transported to Assyria. The ruler statues, on the other hand, were mostly destroyed on spot by hostile conquerors. That is why the archaeologists in Karkemish and elsewhere have discovered images shattered in dozens of pieces that lie around double lion pedestals. Unfortunately, the British excavation team did not draw or photograph the pieces in situ. We might learn something about the methods, how the statues were vandalized. Smashed statues were a clear message for the conqueror that the local power elite had come to its end. As long as the statue and the name on it or on a separate inscription stood intact and the statue received offerings, the memory of the represented one lived on in the community. But when the statues were toppled from their pedestals, decapitated, their faces were often mutilated, their bodies demolished, and the embodiment of its ruler was literally murdered and ceased to exist. For many centuries, we assume that it was the Neo-Assyrian army that caused the havoc, since the Neo-Assyrians did boast both textually as well as visually destroying ruler statues. For a long time, it was thought that Sargon II, when at last taking Karkemish in 1717 BC, would have ordered the Karkemishian ruler statue to be destroyed. Today, Nicola Marchetti, the excavator of Karkemish, has revisited the case, and it seems that most of the city's monuments stood intact until the end of the 7th century. But here's not the time and place to dwell in it any longer. What about our Karkemishian statue? Are there any chances to reassemble it one day, even if virtually? Because the documentation of the British Museum Karkemish expedition was partly destroyed during the World War I, we only had, until recently, following remaining fragments. We have the pedestal in Ankara Museum. The head is here in Paris. One of the lion heads is in London. But then, according also to Güterbock, there are some body fragments in Ankara Museum depot. Fragments of the front and side of the garment are extant. They show frills on the hem and a tassel trailing from the belt as seen on the Chinchilli statue. And the head here in Paris, in Louvre, I studied in November 2016 with the kind assistant of Vincent Blanchard. Due to the fact that the pedestal and the head are very similar to the Chinchilli ruler statue, we have thought that the missing body of our Karkemishyan statue would have looked the same, having a cylindrical form. Thanks to the great efforts of Niccolo Marchetti, he has been giving in gathering all the possible archival material concerning Karkemish. We have now also this valuable photograph taken in 1919 by Frank Pierce, and this photo is currently in the collections of Harvard University. The photo is very small and very bad, but we can clearly see that Lawrence and his team had found other pieces of the statue and had actually reassembled part of its body. You can perhaps see from the touristic picture that this is the body of the statue, being actually quite high, and it's fitting well into this letter of Lawrence, writing home that they have been trying to put it together. And indeed, the body of our statue seems to be quite similar to the Chinchilli piece. One would only wish to have a better quality photos of the statue, but we are of course grateful for having this. Additionally, there might be other small fragments to be joined with the head. I made notes in British Museum archives about some statue fragments, and when I had been here in Paris, I immediately emailed Niccolo Marchetti during the excavation at Karkemish. They have rediscovered many sculpture fragments, and I was of course eager to know if these 2 or 3 pieces would have been refound. Unfortunately, they haven't not popped out again, but if they do, then a modern 3D scanning technology might allow us to try some virtual fittings. I think these are actually fragments belonging to the back of this very statue. Furthermore, Marchetti and his team have unearthed very many more sculpture fragments, and one might identify some more pieces that belonged to our Karkemishian statue, perhaps from the body. I conclude with the hope that I have aroused your curiosity and interest for this important and remarkable group of monuments. Pulling the pieces together has been a fascinating task, and I'm still en route. I am hoping and waiting for the archaeological park at Karkemish will finally be opened this year, inshallah, so that I can visit it and see the very spot where our Karkemish statue was set up. I also hope that I can return to Aleppo sometime soon. My last visit there in September 2010, and I was planning to go back the following spring, especially to study this unpublished piece of a statue coming from the temple area of the Aleppine Storm Guard, and for which Professor Kai Kohlmeier then kindly allowed me to prepare its publication. I am not quite, yes, and I hope that this statue has survived the ongoing crisis in Syria, and I will have a happy rendezvous with it. Merci pour votre attention.